Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deepest part of the night. Make sure you're comfortable and fully settled in for a long one. If the sound of rain helps you shut down and drift into sleep, then you've found your sanctuary here, a place where darkness meets calm. And if this blend of deep horror and a calming storm helps you find that inner quiet, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe for more long, rainy nights. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Now, let the rain wash your worries away, breathe in the silence of the storm. Let's begin the journey. Story 1. I was the senior maintenance lead overseeing the entire immense structural integrity of a massive, cold, concrete, brittlest train classification hub, an entire vast, sprawling, silent network of decommissioned rail yards and repair docks situated exactly 3 miles from the cold riverbank in Buffalo, New York. My total focus was the integrity of the underground fiber optic control lines running beneath the massive freight yard. My schedule was simple: midnight to 6 a.m., entirely alone, battling a terrifying, chaotic, aggressive, non-stop rainstorm that completely consumed the entire metallic surface structure of the main building with immense, continuous sonic pressure. My initial terror was subtle, deeply internal, and purely professional. I was isolated in the old, immense, primary dispatch tower, 4 tall stories of cold, black-painted steel structure perched precariously over the vast, black landscape of the abandoned switching yard. The room was utterly silent. I was logged into the digital main system, cross-checking the structural integrity of the copper transfer data, when the entire complex, fully operational, precise fiber optic network abruptly failed. Not due to power loss but simple, inexplicable structural error. My final error screen illuminated a precise, localized internal malfunction error, unknown cargo weight. Primary sector T5 gone. I screamed single denial against the single source truth. The entire yard's output was digital, clear, and utterly stable. The network recovered immediately. But the single error report persisted. My terror fully solidified when I looked down from the sealed top floor of the immense, cold tower. In the vast, black, wet landscape of the dead tracks below, only a single, dark, enormous, precise, human-sized silhouette moved, a massive, 7-foot-tall, single figure draped entirely in the thick, old, black, professional cloth of a railway conductor's uniform, carrying a massive, rusted, thick conductor's lantern which emitted a sickly, weak, intensely yellow light. The figure was utterly silent, standing completely in the center line of the vast electrical switching area. The figure was not moving toward the active tracks. It was striding purposefully toward the single, high ground control station, the vast, ancient, dead analog electrical switchgear structure adjacent to the base of my tower. The terrifying figure moved completely unhindered by the massive structural noise of the rain and wind, defying all ambient forces in its singular, precise, intimidating march. My logic was entirely shredded. The immense figure reached the cold, dark, colossal switchgear box, and immediately leaned himself entirely onto the vast, cold, rusted steel control platform, fixing his unmoving, empty line of sight directly up at my completely unlit structural tower. The silence was absolute. Immediately, the entire single console of my digital tracking system on the top floor erupted entirely. The clear digital tracking matrix was consumed by a violent, organized explosion of aggressive, green-on-black ASCII code. The frightening, massive text filled every single screen with terrifying, precise, detailed, continuous output, not error code, but immense, rapid, precise, organized ghostly narrative being typed directly onto the active structural terminal. The language was coherent. The precise logistics of a single forgotten cargo manifest from a tragic acid spill accident 20 years prior, entirely detailing the lethal mistake of the conductor I was entirely staring at. I screamed and ripped the master power cable completely out of the system base. Total, immediate silence. The profound, clean silence of deep electrical death. The conductor's massive, silent black figure entirely dissipated, slowly dissolving back into the entire blackness of the single, vast electric sorting yard. But a single acoustic shadow persisted, a deep, profound, continuous, completely organized, metallic squeak 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 that I realized was not a sound of metal. It was the pure, rhythmic, dry, physical sound of a dead electrical worker's dry vocal cord completely repeating the single, terrifying, lethal coordinate grid of the last fatal acid spill accident. I fled the entire complex. I abandoned the job, the contract, the full safety data, and all the high-value electrical equipment entirely to the external chaos of the complete, ongoing massive storm. The haunting final, bitter truth of the code that spoke was simple, terrifying, and precise. The vast, single railway complex was entirely co-opted, entirely possessed by the organized, immense, powerful, vengeful soul of a single, deeply professional and deeply destroyed railway conductor, driven mad by the massive final failure of his massive cargo consignment. His terrifying command over the entire digital network was merely his final, immense, concentrated effort to provide the immense structural data needed to finally ensure that the dangerous, unstable cargo line was never allowed to move again. The terrifying figure's final logical action was one last, absolute, aggressive, organized, overwhelming act of digital fidelity, to permanently use the single-core structural electrical access of the vast network to completely ensure the structural paralysis of every single element of the entire system as its final, eternal, physical rest. Story 2. Up on the isolated, immense, cold, fog-bound pier of an old, decommissioned log freight dock in Michigan, a sprawling, vast, century-old timber structure entirely exposed to the endless rage of Lake Superior, I was utterly alone on my night structural audit. The total structural isolation was permanent, physical, and complete. The background sound was cold, immense chaos. The immense, deep roar of the massive freshwater waves relentlessly pounding an SLMMING against the decaying pilings, permanently amplified by the heavy, thick, continuous rain that completely consumed the entire metallic surface of the isolated platform. My single, final task was a comprehensive, long-term integrity log of the dock's cold, immense, support columns. My initial terror was visual and complete. I was using a massive, submerged, tethered video light to illuminate the immediate vertical surface of the immense support timbers. The camera image was beamed live to my cold, empty console on the isolated small aluminum audit shack. The surface of the timber was immense, black, decaying, and permanently saturated wet concrete. But a single, unnerving, entire shadowy figure entirely filled the immense view in an aggressive, still human form. Not a simple reflection, not a trick of the immense deep black water static, a massive, terrifying, black golem, an organized, immensely dense human form entirely composed of compressed, thick, dark silt and decaying, rotted wood fibers, was absolutely stuck entirely on its own silent timber pylon, entirely dominating the deep, dark column. It was absolutely motionless, entirely covered with immense, trailing masses of vast, wide, dead black kelp and immense timber decay. The towering figure just stood, its colossal head entirely obscured by the deep, terrifying mass of material, permanently fixed to its base. The moment I completely logged the overwhelming image on my console, the massive, utter roar of the continuous environment suddenly completely ceased. The entire vast environment of the structure and the vast, cold water was consumed by a profound, frightening, immense silence, completely separated only by the soft, rhythmic sound of the cold, chaotic, heavy rain. My structural reality was an obvious lie. The terror did not wait for my logic. The entire immense water column around the massive black form began to absolutely scream, a total, profound, gut-wrenching, prolonged human crying that entirely filled the void. The sound was not a single victim. It was the intense, sad sobbing song of 1,000, terrified drowned souls, forever fixed to the absolute deepest depth of the cold, dark, structure. The enormous acoustic pressure of the terrible, mass weeping violently strained and vibrated the massive, thick glass of my single observation screen. I abandoned all tools, data, and immense final structural honesty immediately, running hard, completely blind, and screaming down the isolated, immense structural corridor of the dangerous timber dock. My single fear was focused on escaping the profound, isolated sound field. The horrific wailing instantly snapped out of existence the moment my feet made contact with the dry safety of the shoreline 5 full terrifying yards away. The profound terror and the weeping entire completely cut out with a single, massive, hydraulic thwack that hit the massive timber core where the pylon once stood. I ran and did not stop, completely abandoning the terrifying platform and the chaotic, immense, overwhelming rain. The final check by the maintenance crews the following morning yielded a chaotic, terrifying, simple observation: the deep-set, powerful, main structural support pylon that anchored almost a quarter of the vast dock's massive mass was utterly gone. Perfectly removed from its concrete base, leaving a single massive, cold, enormous, empty cylinder of cold, black water in its complete absence. A terrifying, final, colossal hole of nothing where immense structure had completely existed. The logic of dismantling the dock was simpler. The enormous, permanent structural failure I saw in the dark was an aggressive, continuous physical failure sequence initiated by a complex, immensely powerful, permanent structural consuming deity, a confined, angry, monstrous being that used the single structural integrity of the long dock line to permanently contain its entire vast, permanent, powerful presence of immense internal terror. The chaotic, powerful morning cry was not a warning, it was a terrifying, single, aggressive, complex physical song designed solely to completely deafen the single isolated human ear, forcing an escape, so the chaotic, immense structure and the vast, terrifying, malevolent being could complete its final, aggressive, terrifying act of physical architectural self-assassination. Story 3. I was an independent structural auditor, working the vast, remote, deep silent corner of the massive former Bendix industrial complex. A sprawling, immense, concrete and cold steel relic, permanently shut down for decades on the massive outskirts of South Bend, Indiana. My single function was structural integrity checks on the long term, immense damage left by corrosion and slow decay. My schedule was isolated and brutal, midnight to 6 a.m., completely alone, with only the profound, intense silence of the permanent darkness and the incredibly cold, consistent, loud, relentless rainstorm that continuously hammered the immense, raw concrete ceiling high above my frightened head. The entire factory unit felt dead, cold, and utterly terrifying. But my intense logical focus led me to a single, deep, intense, cold, terrifying structural anomaly. I was surveying a small, circular, isolated maintenance access door, one full floor below the vast main pressing hall, a perfect, immensely cold, raw single sheet of incredibly thick, reinforced metal plating, utterly sealed in all its structural entirety, permanently secured by 10 massive chromium bolts. The immense, organized, precise structural plating was designed to permanently seal off the main electrical vault access where a massive, tragic, singular high-voltage failure had completely immolated the lead shift engineer 20 years prior. The metal itself was immense. The profound terror began entirely through sound. I was running a simple stress test on the massive reinforcing beams 20 feet away from the locked door. My noise was immense, loud, and metallic. But I heard a distinct, terrible, faint, continuous, high-pitched tiny meowing sound emanating permanently from the center of the total, physical blackness where the immense power fault had occurred. Not loud, not aggressive, just a constant, high flat, immensely fragile, tiny meowing noise that entire defied the presence of any living creature and the complete structural integrity of the locked, 10-foot-tall steel structure. My logical mind screamed, a small kitten is completely trapped inside the dead air of the massive electric core and must be immediately removed now. I abandoned all professional protocol entirely. I grabbed my largest, immense, raw, metallic pry bar, an immensely long, thick, cold, dense rod of raw, machined steel. I positioned the entire immense final weapon against the first massive external chrome head of the bolt and began to apply continuous, immense, organized, physical lever force. The sound of the grinding, immense, cold, raw, bending steel on the outer chrome head was absolutely deafening, entirely dominating the deep white noise of the enormous external storm. The structure was violently fighting my aggressive intrusion. The cold, thick, permanent structural integrity of the immense metal sheeting completely screamed a raw, terrified denial against the human force. The noise of structural breakdown intensified. I felt the powerful structural plate begin to slowly, mentally yield an infinitesimal crack. 3 full cycles of immense stress I applied to my body against the sheer raw physical denial of pure science. But as I pulled against the immovable finality, the simple, faint, high sound from the complete center of the single steel plate of the 10-foot-tall door intensified. The raw sound complexity changed entirely. It was no longer a beautiful, pathetic, simple kitten pleading. The noise had completely inverted its emotional intent and content. The sonic quality was now a loud, high-pitched, intense, terrifying, clear, sustained, aggressive male shouting, the precise, professional sound of the voice of the single lead industrial engineer who had been catastrophically burned to profound structural ash in the electrical fire that caused the entire section's failure. The immense acoustic attack was entirely overwhelming and entirely focused on my terrified ears. The agonizing, aggressive electronic screaming ended suddenly. The entire complex was enveloped in a cold, absolute silence. My own terror was complete. I dropped the full weight of the massive pry bar onto the cold concrete. It made an immense crash that completely overwhelmed the acoustic safety of the massive space. The silence that followed was complete, whole, utter, and immediately replaced by a quick, dry, absolutely cold, low male whisper that spoke directly, perfectly into the compressed air of the single, small, isolated internal cavity between the pry bar and the main structural wall. The final safety line is broken, Mark. No. The fear is the real source of the fire. You cannot stop the work, or the shame will return. You must finish your audit now. I never moved a muscle. I completely abandoned the terrifying platform and the single, colossal steel door immediately. I left the pry bar, the valuable instruments, and the entire structural collapse entirely to the final cold silence, running completely, entirely and violently hard out of the immense building and completely abandoning my current existence for safety. The terrifying logistical failure of the boiler operator gets stuck was entirely simple, immediate and correct. The structural chaos and sound anomalies I experienced were the aggressive, desperate, organized, final soul of the long-dead, deeply professional structural engineer who had failed his massive final high-voltage inspection, trapping his entire physical terror and immense emotional failure entirely inside the single massive steel access plate to his single final structural act. Now, entirely contained, his colossal emotional trauma was amplified by the cold, dense rain-driven sonic pressure to entirely become the structural logic of the final sound sequence. The sheer terror was his full conviction to simply recruit the single, terrified, living auditor's muscle to assist him in a perpetual, internal process of structural suicide, forcing the complete, final structural failure of his eternal tomb from the absolute outside. Story 4. I was running an emergency, solo salvage contract in the deepest tract of the Grand Canyon National Park, a remote, dangerous operation to recover lost drone material from a private geological company. My operating base was a single, immense, cold, windswept viewpoint tower, a massive, open-concept timber frame structure perched terrifyingly over the immense, 1,000-foot-deep chasm of the cold abyss. My physical existence was entirely solo, driven to madness by the sheer isolation and the continuous, cold, immense, aggressive, rhythmic sound of a massive, violent thunder and torrential downpour that had utterly obliterated all visual reality outside the immediate base of the railing. The profound structural terror began not with the silence, but with the acoustic echo reflection itself. I was performing a low, manual check on the drone output signal, completely alone, isolated by the acoustic blanket of the single rainstorm. Suddenly, a terrifying, intensely sharp, rhythmic, simple noise erupted on the main visual tracking signal output screen, a precise, massive, single, short burst of human laughter. Not simple humor, but organized, complete, uncontrolled, genuine human GLE, rapidly cutting through the intense whitewash of the external chaos. The profound acoustic accuracy was entirely localized, entirely internal, and fully human-made, immediately followed by a low, consistent, profoundly disturbing, chaotic splash impact sound, the final, distinct sound of a massive object hitting an immense volume of cold fluid at high speeds. My absolute structural logic completely failed. I ran to the single edge of the wet, exposed railing and stared down the sheer, massive, dark cliff into the profound, empty abyss of the colossal chasm. The entire immense structural volume below me was utter, absolute silence. Total structural emptiness. The noise of the laughter was utterly defying the immense scale of the environment. I immediately grabbed my small directional acoustic probe, a piece of sophisticated directional audio sampling gear, and pressed its cold, accurate sensor hard against the sheer, granite wall of the enormous vertical cliff right beside my base. The full, immense structural resistance gave way to a new terror. The sound that filled my headset was completely overwhelming. The rhythmic laughter was there, persistent, chaotic, and multiple. The continuous, massive, collective sound of three full, high-pitched, incredibly cold and wet voices now entirely consumed the acoustic field. Two males and one highly distinct female shriek, all laughing full, hysterical glee for exactly 15 terrifying seconds of intense structural sound trauma. The aggressive sonic attack was entirely localized. The laughing was echoing, bouncing perfectly, not once, but endlessly between the sheer vertical structural walls of the deep inner canyon. The single, simple scientific truth broke my terror. The immense, isolated, sheer acoustic chamber of rock beneath my feet was echoing the immense, terrifying, organized sound of every single human trauma it had ever heard on the high observation deck. The canyon's echo was finally returning its full volume of sound trauma to the final single human observer. As the single, massive, continuous sound was about to conclude, one of the hysterical, frantic, cold, powerful, laughing female voices rose high above the full acoustic volume of the terrified chorus. It screamed one single, entire sentence directly into the internal microphone line. "You never caught me, Mark! I'm still here now! Tell him I am free and laughing!" The cold, chaotic sound immediately ended. Silence was absolute. The entire chaotic white noise of the structure seemed to vanish. I fled the terror immediately. I completely abandoned the sheer metal rail and the structural complex immediately, tearing the entire structure array from its moorings and running hard from the entire vast structural platform. Final structural analysis from the police who followed my frantic calls cited structural collapse from the pressure. The sheer, dry, structural integrity of the entire high sheer wall beneath the platform was completely lost in a full vertical line of collapse. I never returned to the high desert again. The chilling, absolute, permanent structural realization of the canyon observer was simple, terrifying, and profoundly complete. The massive chamber of rock I was occupying was not a simple geological chamber. It was an immensely powerful, terrifying, massive acoustic reflection chamber that accurately contained the single sonic trauma of every single, terrifying, final moment of human emotional collapse it had ever physically witnessed. The loud, organized, single final human laughter I heard was entirely derived from an extremely high-speed, intense external sonic event, a single vehicle accident I had witnessed years ago, a final, hysterical, total wave of profound structural finality that the rock had entirely recorded and amplified across the endless acoustic walls of the single high canyon. My own single terrified voice, entirely alone, was simply the electrical cue the organized vast acoustic memory needed to transmit its horrible psychic playback of total structural collapse directly into my exposed ears. Story 5. I bought the small, two-bedroom bungalow purely for the cheap rent and its massive, overgrown backyard. It was a 1920s relic in the quiet, historic area outside of Louisville, Kentucky, all damp brick, deep wood, and a constant, profound air stagnation that made the whole place smell of age and disuse. My single constant was my single point of weakness. The doormat. A massive, thick, high-quality coir mat, positioned outside the small front door, that read, in huge, clear, friendly letters, "Welcome." When I bought the bungalow, the mat was pristine, flat, and new. Within 6 short weeks of my tenancy, the mat had become intensely, severely worn out. It was utterly destroyed across its long, vertical axis. The natural brown fibers had been entirely worn down to the thin, cracked, black rubber backing. The severe, unnerving damage formed a thick, deep, single track that ran perfectly from the far right side corner of the front door, ran across the entire length of the mat, and terminated precisely just 2 inches from the far corner of the opposite curb. The damage was completely inexplicable and deeply unsettling. I was a single man. I rarely had visitors or social calls. The rhythmic, unnatural track on the mat meant that the heavy traffic was constant, organized, and focused on an unknown single ingress/egress trajectory. Driven by a mounting sense of fear, I simply replaced the mat. I bought an identical, heavy-duty cocoa coir mat from the local hardware store and placed it carefully on the clean porch concrete. My anxiety was now focused on the single goal of preserving the pristine condition of the new mat. The new mat quickly suffered the same fate. Within 1 short month, the second, massive, beautiful mat was completely annihilated in the exact, identical, unnervingly high-intensity linear pattern, worn to the black rubber backing, completely destroyed across the entire vertical line, precisely from the right-hand corner of the door to the left, and back toward the curb line. The pattern of destruction was not random. It was organized, intense, and deeply purposeful. I placed a total of 4 identical mats out over the next 3 months. Each one was methodically destroyed by an invisible, single trajectory force. The terrifying truth of the worn-out welcome mat was simple. An immense amount of perpetual, physical, constant heavy pressure was being applied to the mat, moving back and forth, right in front of my own eyes. The psychological terror intensified into physical breakdown. Any time I was inside my kitchen, just feet from the front door, a huge whoosh of oppressive cold air would immediately rush past the bottom jam seal, carrying a terrifying, single, continuous, profound scent of intense, sour ozone. It was the overwhelming smell of sustained, high-intensity electrical discharge mixed with a faint background odor of extremely old, stale, dried-out church incense. The smell was directly associated with the motion needed to destroy the mats. I could almost map the destruction by the immense energy signature needed to achieve that kind of permanent physical effect. I became physically paralyzed by the pattern. I refused to let any new matter or object be destroyed in such a terrifying, useless manner. I meticulously scraped all the old rubber and residue away, leaving a clean, bare section of cold, original 1920s concrete under the front door for the mysterious, organized motion. I fully retreated indoors to the absolute safety of my chair. That's when the final attack began. As the sound of immense, constant, full-volume rain lashed the roof and sealed my fate, in the complete quiet of the atmosphere, I heard the sound that confirmed I didn't want to be there. The enormous, rhythmic, powerful, low-frequency slap-smash-slap of something massive and flat being beaten onto the bare concrete slab outside my front door. The sound was so immense it shook the entire house's foundation, vibrating the very floorboards beneath my feet. Not a random impact, but a constant, highly directed, intense rhythmic violence. The persistent, furious noise of an angry, profound, demonic entity that was completely defeated by the removal of its single point of resistance. I immediately knew the worn-out welcome mat entity had simply reached down to punish the single new point of its constant resistance. The massive slap-smash SLA ping on the front concrete immediately stopped. In the sudden and total silence, the whole house plunged into an acute state of permanent, deep cold. The only final sound was an intense, slow, organized, profound rumble that emanated entirely from the concrete slab itself, a sound of immense, deep internal satisfaction. A voice, unnaturally dry and smooth, with a terrible, low-frequency resonance that vibrated the entire air in my own room, spoke one final, chilling word right directly into the bottom edge of my bolted front door. Finish. The terrifying word faded instantly, the immense, profound cold that filled the house retreating entirely back out toward the slab. I opened the door 5 minutes later, fully armed. The small, unassuming section of the entryway concrete was perfectly clean, undented. The only physical anomaly, etched violently, irreversibly, and permanently deep into the single clean line of the gray, dry concrete slab, a clear, perfectly formed linear track of intensely white-hot scorching. A perfect, defined line of white-hot stress damage ran the entire 7 feet from the jamb of the door to the curb line. Unquestionably immense, high-intensity heat and friction-based activity had occurred against the bare single surface. I fled the house, never returning. I left the job, the money, and all the content immediately within the city limits. The terrifying final structural truth of the worn-out welcome mat was logical, terrifying, and completely organized. The house's perpetual occupant wasn't a friendly ghost waiting for a return, but a physical demon that was permanently locked into a single eternal ritual of physical departure, and its physical single trauma was only triggered and amplified by the single layer of material I had laid down. The terrifying violence and total structural hostility I lived through was merely the permanent, profound, organized, massive, structural effort required to burn its permanent, single, human-scale egress path entirely through the final foundation slab of the house. Story 6. I was the final cleaning auditor for a massive, brutalist, century-old high school gymnasium complex in a cold, forgotten suburb of Boise, Idaho. The entire massive structure, metal, glass, and immense concrete blocks, had been condemned and perfectly sealed for a complete decade. My single terrifying job was a final midnight to dawn survey, entirely alone, certifying the structural integrity and logging all the vast residual chemical decay. The permanent ambient sound was a deep, immense silence, constantly interrupted by the continuous, harsh, rhythmic sound of a massive, industrial-grade rain and windstorm that furiously pelted the vast, metal-sheathed structure. My initial fear was logical: trespassers. I was running a final sweep past the immense main locker room, a cold, massive, terrifying expanse of 700 individual metallic units, all completely empty, utterly still, reflecting the intense industrial emergency lighting I had set up. The cold air reeked of stale paint, deep mold, and an immense, powerful, dry, concentrated, forgotten BO that clung permanently to the rusted metal boxes. The profound terror began with sound. A thin, repetitive, rhythmic clank rose above the massive, cold, structural silence, emanating entirely from within the deepest structural heart of the vast locker configuration. The chaotic rhythmic sound was continuous, aggressive, and highly organized, the perfect acoustic noise of multiple, heavy, physical objects being violently, rapidly, intentionally smashed against the thin, uninsulated sheet steel of the immense, metal box complex. I reached for my security radio, but before I could transmit, the single source of sound aggression immediately changed its intent. The intense, aggressive, physical clanging completely froze into absolute silence. The silence was immediately broken by a single, loud, organized, simple cheering sound, a sharp, quick, coherent roar of pure, simple, ecstatic human happiness that filled the vast architectural empty volume. The immense chaotic sound was immediately followed by a powerful, concise, single, entirely aggressive shouting voice that spoke directly, entirely unprompted, from the air surrounding the single structural component of the immense, cold, metal row of lockers. 10 more laps! You lost the final point! Go! 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 You aren't worthy, Smith! Again! Again! I was completely paralyzed by the massive acoustic attack. The complex, male voices were entirely accurate, utterly distinct, professional, and terrifyingly fixed to their single, specific, athletic trauma. The immense acoustic attack completely defied the physical law of a permanent structural silence. I realized the profound truth of empty lockers speak. The haunting was entirely driven by the vast, immense, powerful, emotional trauma of an entire terrified, defeated athletic team that was now permanently trapped, entirely confined to its final structural location, the entire massive volume of the hundreds of steel boxes I was entirely inspecting. Their terrifying, isolated agony was permanently fixed to the space. The aggressive sound structure was the persistent, organized, eternal punishment ritual being enacted by the monstrous figure of their immense, deceased permanent coach. I collapsed entirely under the immense psychological load of human despair and immense, rhythmic, organizational complexity above their singular, organized structural defeat. I lay immobile on the cold, vast, gray concrete floor for 30 agonizing minutes, completely focused on entirely surviving the terrifying, organized, structural torment. The coach's aggressive, rhythmic, commanding voice was continuous, entirely unflagging in its vast, organized aggression. My final act was simple. I tore a vast piece of stiff, dry, cold structural tape from my audit panel, completely covering the external microphone, sealing all sound out. The intense volume of the commanding coach's rhythm immediately ceased on the final structural application of my physical defense. I fled the complex completely, abandoning all my personal gear and my last single piece of organizational sanity entirely. The simple, vast, permanent logistical truth of the intense, silent gymnasium complex was simple, terrifying, and entire. The aggressive, powerful, loud sound anomalies were entirely driven by the single, immense, collective, psychological anguish of the permanent athletic catastrophe that had permanently consumed the complex. The single ritual of the endless, painful shouting was entirely designed to be a perpetual, inescapable, rhythmic final replay of all their moments of profound shame, defeat, and professional structural failure. My terrified human escape had entirely saved my life. Final, entire, absolute truth remains. I am permanently terrified of any single space, entirely defined by structural silence, that forces me to hear the aggressive, perfect, clean, continuous, controlled sound of a final, permanent, terrifying, powerful, industrial command. Story 7. I was an independent contractor taking on seasonal audits of environmental infrastructure along the massive coastline of the Pacific Northwest, specifically the long, sheer, lonely sea wall on the coast near Astoria, Oregon. My job was straightforward: alone, midnights to dawn, complete audit of the old drainage and low-lying structural support areas, completely exposed to the elements. My permanent ambient background was cold, vast, and acoustically hostile. The immense, rhythmic roar of the massive, cold Pacific waves incessantly pounding and collapsing against the vertical cement cliff face below me, completely blanketed by a low, profound, continuous sheet of severe, freezing horizontal rain that turned the entire structure into a slippery, immense, terrifyingly cold surface. My fear began entirely through my own physical movement. I was walking along, single, smooth stretch of the highest perimeter walk, an intensely cold, fog-bound platform that had been thoroughly rained and washed clean a mere 5 minutes prior. Suddenly, a terrible, persistent, physical anomaly violated the sheer architectural perfection. Right in the clean, immense, completely wet center of the long concrete path, there appeared a single, large, disturbing footprint. Not a light smudge of dirt, but a clearly defined, unnervingly sharp, deep, thick impression of a bare, adult single, incredibly wide human foot, entirely pressed hard into the wet, single surface. The imprint was immense, permanent, and utterly devoid of surrounding disturbance. The physical weight of the entire single print defied all logical explanation. The massive pressure of the single step was required to leave an immense permanent residual stress mark on the hard granite cement blend. I immediately stopped, my own body paralyzed by the sudden appearance of the intense, localized human image. I stepped back a full 10 feet, completely abandoning the clean section of the walk, my own heavily tracked boot prints completely dominating the immediate space around the clean print, and fully isolating the anomaly on the cold, untouched granite surface. The immense, wide, strange footprint was completely still, entirely filled with clean rainwater drain, reflecting only the continuous, aggressive sonic chaos of the profound rain. Terror finally broke my internal psychological resistance. I screamed a raw, disorganized, immense single-syllable sound directly out into the immense environment of the chaotic, cold storm. The vast, rhythmic acoustic terror of the environment did not respond. The powerful, continuous sound of the entire sea washing into the immense sheer wall amplified the coldness. But directly in the extreme foreground, on the single structural line to which the immense, ancient pier complex had been perfectly fixed, a faint, rhythmic, simple slosh sound began. the terrifying acoustic outcome of immense feet slowly, deliberately, softly, and consistently pulling large, sheer weights of permanent water from the dry concrete floor. The persistent, low-frequency intrusion confirmed a terrifying, single structural truth. The enormous power I was sensing was actively and entirely walking straight towards my single isolation point, utterly unhindered and fully organized. I ran back toward the permanent, vast structural access door of the main complex, abandoning the intense horror. I made it to the immense security door and slammed the thick structural casing locked. I was entirely safe, but fully trapped. The final horror was entirely localized and complete. As I stood panting, attempting to communicate my internal collapse to the single outside line, a single, incredibly clear, profound, simple, dark handprint, male, massive, entirely wet to the touch, and perfect in all its 5-digit articulated intensity, suddenly, silently and perfectly materialized out of nowhere onto the cold, dry, dark brick wall 3 feet from my face. The handprint left a massive, flowing line of visible, immense, cold, sea spray and human sweat water running down the sealed internal structure beneath it. The handprint was immediately followed by a massive, aggressive, single, immense, cold male whisper that spoke directly, entirely unprompted, right from the center of the intense, clean, flowing liquid. Your clean path is over now. Here. Your walk is finally finished, Mark. I collapsed completely. I gave in to the sheer terror of structural surrender. The shoreline shadow's final, simple, terrifying goal was absolute. The immense, organized, persistent walking entity, permanently anchored to his single most perfect memory of his final cold walk out to the utter structural collapse of his permanent, professional maritime domain decades ago, was waiting for the single living soul to cross the immense, clean wet threshold and interrupt its structural rhythm. The indelible mark of the footprint was a final, cold invitation to continue the single, slow, terrifying walk the entity was perpetually trapped in. The physical wet handprint on the dry final wall was a single, immense, permanent testament to his one single, specific command to prevent all future life from walking the clean surface. I will never fully trust a straight, single, clean, immensely cold path again in my terrified life. Story 8. I was an independent structural auditor, taking a final full survey contract on an abandoned, immense brick and steel warehouse complex in the vast, still, dark outskirts north of Phoenix, Arizona. The entire site was immense, silent, absolutely sealed, utterly devoid of internal light, and had been static for 2 decades. My job was simple: structural integrity audit of the entire warehouse, midnight to 6 a.m., completely alone, battling the deep structural silence with only the overwhelming, continuous, rhythmic roar of the intense, atmospheric, massive, single rainstorm that entirely engulfed the entire structural complex. The terror began immediately. I was running a final check on the complete structural seal of a small, heavily padlocked cleaning supply closet in the middle of the immense, main floor structure. The door was made of thin, hollowed, rusted, sheet steel, permanently sealed by 2 immense, cold, industrial padlocks that completely bound the 2 immense, structural handle loops. I was running an ultrasonic stress test on the entire permanent seal when my microphone picked up a bizarre, complex, terrifying, organized internal sound, a constant, low, rhythmic, internal tick-tock tick-tock, the precise, simple acoustic echo of an antique, grandfather-style metal clock ticking softly and endlessly inside the dark, confined, permanently sealed interior of the shallow closet space. But this was not the deep, reassuring mechanical sound of complex spring pressure. The internal sound contained a massive, high-pitched, terrifying, aggressive click-click-click, which revealed the precise, clear sound of a single, soft, human fingernail being entirely snapped hard against the delicate, soft glass of the internal clock face. The simple, rhythmic, massive acoustic pressure entirely overcame the high, soft acoustic volume of the outside rain. My mind fractured immediately. I ran a cross-structural sweep of the immense, silent steel door. The metal was too thin to entirely muffle the immense acoustic volume. My logical mind screamed for a simple, logical truth. a broken fan, an electrical failure in the high system. But the persistent, rhythmic, low-level tick-tock entirely defied all external structural origin. I grabbed the single largest, heaviest, raw, metallic pry bar I carried, positioning the immense structural weapon against the single small structural seam of the immense, cold door. As I applied the final, structural pressure, the single click sound inside the entire darkness immediately increased its rhythm by 2 full settings. The terrifying sound was a simple, psychological, entirely organized message about my intrusive presence. The terror was active and fully aware of my exact immediate intentions. My intense physical effort forced the thick steel door enough to create a small, dark, internal crack. The immense sound of the deep, sustained, internal high-velocity, organized clockwork ticking immediately intensified and rose so high in volume that I heard the entire complex ticking perfectly all around me. The terrifying single sound event completely overpowered the entire environment. The moment the small, precise physical separation of the internal and external physical boundaries was complete, an immense, thick, palpable wave of heat rushed outward, a terrifying expulsion of massive, concentrated, internal heat that instantly carried a deep, profound, frightening smell of intense, sour iron and old blood that completely consumed all the stale exterior atmosphere. The heat was followed immediately on the intense physical high-peak sound of the rhythmic ticking by a single, terrifying, rhythmic, low-pitched, utterly agonizing male whisper that spoke precisely, intimately, directly out of the small separation gap. "Don't stop the rhythm, Mark. Don't find me here. The rhythm helps. The silence helps. I can't stop the clock now." The terrifying message ended. My physical terror consumed the final output. I entirely abandoned all property, screaming, running hard through the cold, entire structural complex and out into the terrifying single rainstorm. I quit the contract immediately. The agonizing, absolute, simple, rhythmic acoustic torture permanently remained. The structural reality of the basement clockwork was simple, terrifying, and profoundly correct. The single acoustic anomaly was a single, active, organized, completely confused and painfully demented soul of the long-dead, lonely watchman, permanently trapped after his fatal industrial failure, forever locked into an ongoing, relentless, agonizing acoustic ritual of simple ticking. His entire structural collapse was simply the manifestation of his fear. He was completely terrified that his terrifying, absolute final loneliness would be broken by the final absence of the single reassuring, constant rhythm. Story 9. I was the final cleaning auditor for a massive, brutalist, century-old high school gymnasium complex in a cold, forgotten suburb of Boise, Idaho. The entire massive structure, metal, glass, and immense concrete blocks, had been condemned and perfectly sealed for a complete decade. My single terrifying job was a final midnight to dawn survey, entirely alone, certifying the structural integrity and logging all the vast residual chemical decay. The permanent ambient sound was a deep, immense silence, constantly interrupted by the continuous, harsh, rhythmic sound of a massive, industrial-grade rain and windstorm that furiously pelted the vast, metal-sheathed structure. My initial fear was logical: trespassers. I was running a final sweep past the immense main locker room, a cold, massive, terrifying expanse of 700 individual metallic units, all completely empty, utterly still, reflecting the intense industrial emergency lighting I had set up. The cold air reeked of stale paint, deep mold, and an immense, powerful, dry, concentrated, forgotten BO that clung permanently to the rusted metal boxes. The profound terror began with sound. A thin, repetitive, rhythmic clank-clank-clank rose above the massive, cold, structural silence, emanating entirely from within the deepest structural heart of the vast locker configuration. The chaotic rhythmic sound was continuous, aggressive, and highly organized, the perfect acoustic noise of multiple, heavy, physical objects being violently, rapidly, intentionally smashed against the thin, uninsulated sheet steel of the immense, metal box complex. I reached for my security radio, but before I could transmit, the single source of sound aggression immediately changed its intent. The intense, aggressive, physical clanging completely froze into absolute silence. The silence was immediately broken by a single, loud, organized, simple cheering sound, a sharp, quick, coherent roar of pure, simple, ecstatic human happiness that filled the vast architectural empty volume. The terrifying sound was a simple, psychological, entirely organized message about my emotional withdrawal. I was entirely alone. The absolute sound terror was immediately extinguished. The acoustic output was immediately supplanted by a terrifyingly powerful, immense, terrifying, aggressive, short shouting voice that spoke directly, entirely unprompted, from the air surrounding the single structural component of the immense, cold, metal row of lockers. 10 more laps! You lost the final point! Go! 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 You aren't worthy, Smith! Again! Again! I was completely paralyzed by the massive acoustic attack. The complex, male voices were entirely accurate, utterly distinct, professional, and terrifyingly fixed to their single, specific, athletic trauma. The immense acoustic attack completely defied the physical law of a permanent structural silence. I realized the profound truth of empty lockers speak. The haunting was entirely driven by the vast, immense, powerful, emotional trauma of an entire terrified, defeated athletic team that was now permanently trapped, entirely confined to its final structural location, the entire massive volume of the hundreds of steel boxes I was entirely inspecting. Their terrifying, isolated agony was permanently fixed to the space. The aggressive sound structure was the persistent, organized, eternal punishment ritual being enacted by the monstrous figure of their immense, deceased permanent coach. I abandoned my physical safety gear on the table in the office and crept, silent and low, from the single security office. My last rational thought screamed the only possible theory: what if the sound wasn't meant to be frightening? The continuous, professional rhythm was their only method of physical structural release. I decided to meet their rhythmic language head-on. I grabbed the single largest, wettest towel from the cold bag and made myself a single mute. I then walked to the closest locker, lock 44, and slapped the massive, thick, wet towel hard against the hollow, cold steel of its door. Thwack! I timed my single organic physical sound precisely to the rhythm of the eternal torment. The complete audio reality immediately shattered. The relentless, organized, continuous clanging immediately stopped entirely. A profound, absolute, sudden silence descended that was utterly cold, immense, and entirely consuming, immediately replacing the terrifying background sound of the raging exterior metallic storm. The silence was instantly replaced by a single, terrifyingly organized single whisper. A clear, simple, concise, professional boy's voice that had now fully manifested directly from the air 3 feet behind my right ear, an unnaturally soft, high-pitched plea that completely shattered the silence of the immense, cold facility. Thank you for listening for us, sir. The shame is deep. Our captain still wants to keep the door shut. He says we're not worthy to leave. Are you staying to coach the next game for us now? The whisper finished. The immense, organized, rhythmic clanging immediately and violently returned to the furthest end of the room and immediately increased its rhythm by 2 full power settings, intensifying its speed, sound, aggression, and velocity. Their single leader was not pleased with the human interference. I was now exposed by my brief, compassionate moment of connection. I screamed and ran in a blind panic straight for the front exit of the structure, abandoning the heavy uniform, the expensive equipment, and my quiet life entirely. I collapsed outside, my body completely given over to the freezing, relentless, chaotic storm. The terror of empty lockers speak was simple. The entire complex was haunted not by disorganized ghosts, but by a precise, complex, synchronized team of entirely organized poltergeists trapped in an eternal shame that constantly repeated their specific failure against the cold interior of the complex. My single, final act of compassion listening wasn't a structural compromise. It was a single, immense, emotional acceptance of the full trauma, which had completely broken the team's internal rule for absolute silence against the public space. My simple human intercession had simply enraged their eternal, defeated, ashamed coach, who immediately accelerated their internal torment with a powerful, aggressive burst of organized, absolute rhythm. I will never look up at the full, white light of a gymnasium structure again. The simple sound of pure human noise is their final, absolute, perfect terror. Story 10. I operate a small, single-occupancy weather observation and repair station out on a remote, immense, uninhabited stretch of the New England coastline, a small wooden shack perched precariously right over long sections of sheer granite cliff face. My entire scheduled existence is dedicated to cataloging and correcting the structural anomalies of the weather. The background sound is vast, cold, immense, and entirely hostile, pure, relentless silence entirely blanketed by the chaotic, heavy, continuous, rhythmic rain that completely consumes the entire exposed environment after daylight entirely gives way. My terror began entirely through an act of structural integrity. I was running a basic acoustic audit on the weather system's old internal support tower precisely at 3 a.m., battling a high-velocity, extremely thick coastal fog that made the entire single world of physical perception impossible. Suddenly, over my advanced, isolated ambient acoustic receiver, the simple background static of the structure breaking was eclipsed by a localized, single, loud, utterly clear, profound, simple, immense bell tone. Not the gentle, rhythmic ding of a buoy bell miles away, but the enormous, unique sound signature of the ancient, massive, single industrial fog warning bell attached to the high structural element of the nearby sheer granite wall. The entire structure's unique, immense bong, a sound capable of carrying a structural signal for miles, should have been entirely silent, sealed, and decommissioned fully decades prior. I immediately snapped to attention, grabbing the specialized seismic monitor which was recording all deep earth and structural surface vibration. The full, immense surface resistance of the entire platform was entirely static and cold. My hands were shaking intensely, but the sonic result was entire terror. The next minute of recorded local sound completely and precisely confirmed the single horror, the terrifying, immense, simple bong of the active single bell, unpredictable, loud, immense, was followed immediately by a low, consistent, absolutely clear, entirely aggressive clacking. The acoustic signal was terrifying, the sound of a single, long, heavy, solid wooden bar being slowly, physically, deliberately forced to rub violently against the deep, ancient, raw granite structure of the entire building, perfectly timed to physically interrupt the bell's profound acoustic reverberation. The bell was actively, aggressively fighting its single sonic purpose on the structural granite. My mind completely fractured. I grabbed the master battery pack for the bell's sealed core system, desperately trying to physically shut off the signal. The immense pack was sealed with thick plastic bolts, but as my trembling, exposed fingers wrapped around the two massive screws of the main access hatch, the tremendous, loud, intense bong of the fully functional bell exploded precisely adjacent to my terrified ear. Immediately, a single, pure, perfectly dry, immensely cold whisper spoke directly and precisely off the entire surface of the huge steel battery casing. "The sound is the only way out, Mark. You are entirely blocking the purpose. End the seal now, and let me go." The aggressive, immense volume of sound entire broke my resolve. The full force of acoustic terror made me completely leave the structural position. I screamed and fled the post entirely, running hard, completely, purely terrified, absolutely exposed and entirely abandoning the valuable final structural integrity of the complex. I did not stop until I was running fully, entirely submerged and soaked in the dense, immense, chaotic rain into the first open, lit space of a small suburban gas station. The final police report made simple, honest, technical observation. The entire vast external steel housing of the massive old fog bell had been violently, completely sheared off its base by an uncalculated, unknown, aggressive internal structural force. The total structural failure was completely inexplicable. I know now the terrifying logic of the fog bell's calling. The structure was forever trapped by the relentless psychological pressure of its own permanent, single, unchanging sonic function. The full, cold, sustained rage of the entire vast structural anomaly I could not defeat was due to the spirit of the lost operator permanently sealed inside its immense volume. It was simply trying to structurally destroy IT's own voice, the loud, relentless, organized sonic signal of the bell itself, by forcing an aggressive, complete acoustic release onto the terrifying structural silence of the outside world that I was trying to preserve. Story 11. I was the supervising auditor for a massive, multi-million-dollar, sprawling steel and glass research laboratory complex in the isolated outskirts of suburban Portland, Oregon, a gigantic, cold, entirely sterile structure sealed completely a decade ago, currently undergoing massive technological demolition. My single job was isolated and intense, full, midnight structural clearing of the old biological specimen storage floor, working completely alone. The continuous, loud roar of the industrial dehumidifiers inside was the only pervasive, cold sound, entirely contained within the immense, structural silence of a massive, heavy, intense rainstorm that completely consumed the entire metallic surface structure of the outer core I was entirely working in. The rain was massive, physical, and aggressive. My single greatest terror on the decommissioned floor was a particular structural anomaly, an immense, long, white porcelain, utterly sterile laboratory workbench, a full 15-foot-long single slab that entirely filled the center line of the massive cleaning floor. The surface was totally sterile, absolutely cold, and entirely immobile. But perched precisely on its absolute center, all alone, was an organized, dense, incredibly subtle pile of old, raw, industrial-grade coal dust. It was utterly out of place in the vast, clean, empty, sterile environment. The terrifying, single, continuous sonic attack began as I approached the contaminated final workspace. A loud, rhythmic, persistent click-click-click sound, sharp, high-pitched, metallic, and utterly precise, rose in immense volume from the single pile of deep black dust. I reached for my full-volume industrial suction unit to remove the dangerous contaminant. But the organized sound was entire terror. The single click sound immediately and violently amplified into a continuous, deafening metallic clanging, entirely eclipsing the high acoustic volume of the outside storm. It was the vast, complex, terrifying sound of hundreds of immense, raw, mechanical, simple, cold tools, wrenches, hammers, vast metal rods, being violently, continuously, intentionally, rhythmically thrashed and thrown against the massive, cold, concrete walls of the abandoned room I entirely occupied. The acoustic trauma was entirely organized, continuous, and immense, a terrifying, all-consuming single sonic and physical attack. I was completely paralyzed by the noise. I dropped my suction unit and grabbed a single, immense, pressurized fire extinguisher I had set aside for physical defense. I hit the complex's main fire alarm system in a blind, aggressive attempt to alert the city's single control center. The visual line went immediately hot, loud, and aggressive. But the terrifying chaos and sound did not stop. Instead, a new, single, terrifying, absolute phenomenon occurred. The intense, deafening clanging instantly ceased. Total silence. The silence was immediately replaced by a horrific display of absolute stillness. Right on the center of the contaminated porcelain surface, the immense pile of cold, dry, black coal dust began to move. Not swept by wind outside, but slowly, meticulously, aggressively, it began to organize itself into a perfect, vast, recognizable shape. A massive, terrifying, 5-foot diameter horizontal disk of single, intense, black, deep, dust matter, the single central circle surrounded by an organized stream of constantly shifting, complex, smaller shapes, all terrified, rhythmic, complex figures of tiny, perfect, three-dimensional male human bodies. The entire immense collective was dancing on the clean, cold surface of the immense lab workbench. I screamed and fled the immense lab entirely, abandoning all property, tools, and structural sanity, running hard, completely blind, and screaming out of the nearest sealed structural corridor. The horrifying truth of the factory floor cleaner was complete and irreversible. The massive, acoustic sonic attack was purely a frantic, organized, collective sonic warning from the entire collective of dead, trapped scientists and long-gone industrial workers who had completely succumbed to the vast chemical toxicity on the abandoned floor. The chaotic noise was entirely organized, permanently confined to an eternal, rhythmic, completely exhausting final cleaning duty meant to entirely preserve the massive surface of the massive factory complex in its permanent, original state of industrial sterility. The visual manifestation of their dance, the incredible, perfectly composed, agonizingly quiet dance of dust, was the final, full, structural vision of their terrible, final, single, collective reality. My singular terrifying knowledge was full and absolute that the immense, clean, terrifying volume of space in that factory was forever trapped in an entire, complete, perpetual, clean ritual of filth. Story 12. I was running a massive, isolated, final haul contract for a decommissioned nuclear storage facility, driving a specialized, inert, lead-line transport truck across the long, immense, desolate tract of Nevada's high desert, the region completely outside the range of human influence or signal. My singular anchor to a permanent reality was the complete, continuous, rhythmic roar of the intense, atmospheric, massive, single rainstorm that completely consumed the entire high valley with intense, continuous, profound, immense sonic pressure. Complete sonic immersion. The entire structural terror began entire in the full, cold core of the silent night. I pulled over briefly for my final scheduled check and sleep break, abandoning my immense structural safety entirely for the exposed elements. My internal truck cab, sealed against the immense, chaotic, full-volume environment, was immediately and utterly silent. Suddenly, a terrifying anomaly broke the manufactured quiet. From the small, clean, thin metal structure of the central air ventilation grill right above my head, a rhythmic, deep, profound, isolated whine hiss began, a sound that entire defied mechanical source. The rhythmic noise was intense, high-pitched, complex, and completely dry. The terror was immediately localized and confirmed. A massive, terrifying, invisible source was actively and entirely generating a complex, mechanical sound field entire inches from my exposed head. I lunged for my multi-band emergency shortwave structural scanning equipment, a fragile, sensitive, scientific instrument, and set the dial to receive the single, silent, shortwave transmission frequency I was only licensed to use. When the dial locked onto the required structural frequency, the profound silence was broken by an immense, violent, aggressive burst of chaos, a massive, immediate, terrifying wave of pure audio hate, composed entirely of screaming, white, incoherent static, that completely overwhelmed my structural auditory defense. The terror was all concentrated into the confined line. The chaotic frequency completely snapped off the line, immediately replaced by a clean, dry, controlled, low-frequency, simple voice. The male voice was entirely calm, completely devoid of emotion or any discernible inflection, but possessed the terrifying structural focus of an aggressive, single, absolute, final declaration. It spoke one precise, chilling sentence directly into the cold glass of my small instrument output screen. "She is watching now, Mark. Get out of the single line, now. The truck is their payment." The entire message was short, brutal, terrifying, and utterly complete in its single structural message. I immediately abandoned all protocol, tearing the entire structural scanner from the massive control port. My focus was terror. I ran from the immense pressure onto the desolate, immensely cold asphalt of the vast, open structural complex. The profound terror only intensified with the single rhythmic, terrifying, physical sound of the rhythmic external rain. I looked fully at the entire colossal structural body of my massive, immense, silent, lead-line transport truck, totally submerged in the deep, constant, immense rain. The entire body of the transport machine vibrated entirely, a slow, deep, complex, rhythmic oscillation I could feel vibrating my sole of my shoes and entire nervous structural system. The entire massive metal truck structure was under sustained, silent, aggressive, psychic attack. My singular terrifying escape was initiated only by the final acoustic structural signal. I lunged back into the driver's seat, forcing the entire truck onto the deep, soft, immense roadside shoulder, entirely abandoning the single highway structural right-of-way I had protected for the previous 2 full weeks. The immense, organized structural pressure and profound silent hate on the simple cab and the enormous, highly sensitive cargo entirely stopped. The silent, vast structural unit immediately entered an immense, stable, perfect equilibrium. The psychological and structural terror entirely ceased. I quit the job entirely, abandoning the immense, radioactive lead-line structural unit completely untouched to the single source of its profound vulnerability, the intense, vast, remote, isolated, powerful, absolutely quiet, external desert structural environment. My profound final structural terror was simple, cold, and absolute, a terrifying, organized, immense demonic entity, entirely composed of concentrated, radioactive structural energy, was completely and finally possessing the massive, powerful, cold, single structural unit of my transport truck. The entire aggressive sonic field I had experienced was merely the agonizing, organized, concentrated, physical sonic vow of the entire monstrous structural intelligence, demanding its final, permanent, structural right-of-way on the single empty structural road and demanding a complete, silent, final, absolute ritual of surrender. I had entirely survived by permanently abandoning its highly valued single structural item, entirely leaving the powerful, complete malevolent entity to occupy its final, permanent, enormous structural home.